welcome to our new podcast on the future of data and data governance and AI. So I'm Molly Slann. I'm an associate principal in the training team, as you know, Simon. I've got a few years' experience working in data governance for a multinational as a Kubrick consultant. And I'm joined by Simon Duncan, the head of data management. Simon.
Yeah. Hi, Molly. Good morning. And actually in the new office as well, which is worth mentioning.
It's lovely.
Absolutely amazing.
Absolutely fantastic.
Now, introducing myself. So I was just saying to everyone here, as I talked to the microphone and looking at Molly, this is my 1,157th day at Kubrick.
Fantastic.
We started, as you remember from being on one of the cohorts, in April 2018. And over that period, there has been a sustained growth development, not just in terms of our practice, but also in terms of our industry. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. One of the pioneering, front-running aspects of our practice, which is looking at machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Absolutely. And that's the main theme of this podcast series, right? We want to be exploring data governance and its changing landscape, the changing data landscape, especially focusing on that responsible, ethical AI development, engineering development and deployment, and also how data governance is changing to be more autonomous and augmented. I think one of the aims of this podcast, right, is to show the link between those two generally segregated topics, that governance, that technology. So in this episode specifically, we're going to be discussing the need for basic governance, especially in AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning. Why are we having these discussions, Simon? Why is it important?
What's interesting is that we're now in a place where we're rewriting our content. Now, when I wrote the content initially in 2018, I had to focus on what would be most constructive within Kubrick's early hire, train, deploy model,
right,
but also what was relevant within data management. So when I'd gone through those large regulatory projects, data management, data governance were distinct, and the governance, where governance fitted, was still very much in flow. And one of the benefits was that the data management body of knowledge was put together very much as a result of that long run of EU regulations that applied to us as well within the financial sector, culminating in GDPR, which was applied across a broad range of industries, all companies operating within the UK, EU, as we were then. But I think in terms of concepts, what's important is that when I started this, there were a number of aspects I chose to exclude, partly because of infrastructure requirements, etc., but also conceptually how to train our consultants, then, and it was very much looking at the data model and the three layers of the data model: the logical, the conceptual, and then the physical. And what I didn't need to do was spend too much time looking at the physical model in putting the content together. I prepared you and other consultants very much looking at that logical layer,
yes,
but looking up to the conceptual layer. What we've seen, and this is a strong motivation for rewriting our content, is how the physical layer has become much more integral to our delivery process. So the new US cohort that's set up at the moment, we've been talking about policy as code. So here we find governance, which used to be very much a people approach, shall we say. Now we find that we're looking at an unpeopled approach to governance, which is why we've chosen to set up these range of podcasts so we can highlight how governance is becoming unpeopled and what that means in terms of ethics and governance itself, overseeing of data.
Absolutely. And that unpeopled governance is something we're going to unpack in a lot more detail in the second podcast episode that we've got. But before we move further, that was a great explanation of why we need to have these discussions. But I think it's really important that we define what data governance is and also what AI and ML is. So if we start with, you mentioned the data management body of knowledge, Dharma's DOMBOK, which as one of your consultants is my holy grail. we'll refer to their definition of data governance, which is the exercise of authority, control, and shared decision-making, which is planning, monitoring, and enforcement over the data management of data assets. In data management, it's the process of setting, controlling, administering, and monitoring conformance with policy. There's a lot of words there, but I think the one that always has resonated with myself and a lot of the other people that we train on data governance is that data governance is there for oversight. It's there to provide that oversight of the processes and the data that we have within an organisation. So the next definition I think we just need to clarify is AI and machine learning. So do you want to run us through what that is? Because there's a lot more to unpack with those words.
Yes, and this is an area where certainly I wouldn't claim the same level of expertise as I would with data management or data governance.
No.
But AI, artificial intelligence, or A&I, as I refer to it, because it's an oxymoron, so artificial and intelligent. And the definition here is the creation of software that imitates human behaviors and capabilities. Now, won't unpack that, but AI has 5 key workloads, and this is us just going through these foundational definitions. So the one most people know about are machine learning, which is the foundation for an AI system. And that highlights the distinction, that they're not synonymous, as it is the way to teach computer models to predict and draw conclusions from data. So if we look at those different aspects, supervised, so making predictions, or unsupervised, uncover data patterns using ML algorithms. Now, maybe you want to discuss the large language models, because we've got a bit there.
Absolutely. So, AI and machine learning, I think they're big buzzwords, right, that have been throwing around left, right, and centre at the moment, especially within the data industry, because it's developing so quickly with the generation of things like ChatGPT. But ChatGPT is an example of generative AI. Now, generative AI is underpinned by a large language model and a deep neural network. Large language models, for those non-experts like yourself and me, are deep learning algorithms. And deep learning teaches a computer to process data in a way that is inspired by the human brain. Large language models use that deep learning and large data sets, that's the reason it's called large, to be trained. So ChatGPT, like I said, is an example of a large language model, as is the rest of generative AI. I think it's worth us emphasising that generative AI is only one subset of machine learning and artificial intelligence, but it's what's at the forefront at the moment, so we can't ignore it, we need to talk about it. So generative AI specifically refers to those deep learning models that can generate high quality text, images, and other content, and it's based on the data that they were trained on. Now, there's a lot of governance and regulatory kind of considerations there. Is there anything that we need to unpack from that?
Well, I think the first thing is what we've done is we've looked at objective definitions. And when we talk about AI, machine learning, large language models, etc., we're talking about an objective collection, use of data. There's no subjective aspect there. Possibly subjective aspect in what data is collected. That's possibly the subjective, but it's designed and built on the accessibility, reusability of data. But it's trained by individuals. So that's potentially where there's a subjective aspect in this. But when you look at the benefits, or the so-called benefits that we read so much about in terms of generative AI, leveraging our understanding, leveraging our accessibility to data, all those aspects of interoperability, leveraging data and such things, that's where the challenge is. Because ultimately these outputs are used by people. And how those people are trained themselves to use those outputs is one of the challenges that requires a great deal of oversight. These are objective processes that are creating what are believed to be enhanced interpretation and use of data. But they are ultimately still used by people.
Absolutely. I think it's a good kind of segue into how data governance and AI and machine learning link inherently. And it is that people. You mentioned earlier that actually a lot of data governance is moving away from people as technology is developing, but people and the way that they use technology and tools still underpins and should still underpin governance and how it works and what we do with it. Why do we need those guidelines for machine learning and AI?
If potential decisions using large language models, using generative AI, etc., if those decisions are taken that involve people, decisions, etc., and we've done this within GDPR and such things with the misuse or use of personal data, when you're looking at the accuracy of data. What we've got here is we've got large language models, etc., that are being applied and can impact many people's lives. But what are the checks in place for data quality? And that's not even governance. That's just looking at data management.
Yeah.
When you start thinking about governance, that's when you start thinking, well, what are the aspects of oversight reporting that determine and identify the quality of that data that's being applied to make decisions about human souls?
And I think a lot of those decisions and the inputs, the outputs that we're getting from machine learning and AI at the moment can be exemplified if we focus a little bit more on things like ChatGPT, where we've got so many people leveraging it at the moment, and lots of different organisations are now having to produce guidelines on how employees should be using. Universities are putting guidelines out there on how students should be using it to make sure that they are actually getting the right information out of a generative AI system. And I think one of the most interesting topics that's happening at the moment, you and I have had quite a lot of discussions on this, is that the leaders of ChatGPT a few months ago, it was about a month ago, turned out and said, we need regulation. I need to put this statement out there. ChatGPT, generative AI needs regulation. It needs governance. A couple of days post saying that, he then said, should the regulation and the guidelines be too strict, we'll leave the EU. We won't get involved. So how can we start to balance this? How can regulators balance this? How can organisations balance the use of this technology whilst also thinking about implementing the guidelines to protect themselves, their employees, the people that are using it, and the outputs, the developers?
Well, and this is why, to complement part of these podcasts, we're putting together a series of papers as well. And the first one we put together was on the EU AI Act. And that's the EU attempting to follow their data strategy that they actually articulated a few years back now. But the idea is to have that same influence and impact that the EU had achieved with personal data protections with the GDPR. But what's really, when you look at one of the key themes coming through the EU AI Act, there's the term human-centric. And this is very much because the legacy of the EU goes around the European Charter of Human Rights, which is something that I had to study as a student. And looking at that human-centric, using words like trustworthiness, those are key terms that the EU have determined will be prevalent, present, and enforced when AI, artificial intelligence, in whatever manifestation, generative AI or whatever, when it's applied, not necessarily just making decisions about people, but how that information is identified, collected, and processed. So not only is a key thing coming from the EU AI Act on the human-centric aspect, but also making the responsibility, the teeth of the regulation, are primarily focused on those generative organizations. They are the ones. So when the head of ChatGPT says, well, I'm not going to involve our product in Europe, not surprising, because he's potentially going to have 7% of global turnover if he's in breach. Now, we're only at the first stage. We've got to go through the trilogue with this EU AI Act.
Of course.
But it really is interesting how, in terms of personal data protections, we saw the influence GDPR had on the California personal data regulations, the New York Shield regulation. In fact, the Americans exceeded in terms of biometric, but that's detail that we'll talk about elsewhere. But I think this idea of focusing on the human-centric aspects, placing the responsibility, placing the meat of the regulation, the teeth of the regulation on these producers, the owners of these products, and at the same time highlighting terms like trustworthiness. Those are key.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned there the 7% possible fine, right? And I think there's a balance that we try to strike through when we're implementing governance all throughout. It's how do we balance being too stringent versus too flexible with everything that we're doing with data? Is there a way that governance frameworks, for example, for machine learning and for AI, can help to strike that balance internally to promote that innovation whilst also ensuring kind of more ethical and responsible use that doesn't necessarily focus on the regulation? Is there any way we can build governance frameworks to support that?
Well, I think, we've highlighted this difference between peopled and unpeopled governance. And I think what we've been preparing for this new US cohort, which has been really a lot of fun, I think, for all of us, has terms like policy as code.
Yes.
Where we're actually embedding stakeholder-driven governance oversight, but as opposed to making it a data office responsibility where people are engaging with different operational teams, we hope our governance engineers will be going directly to the stakeholders, identifying those aspects of policy that can be written as logical statements, because we're still talking about an objective process, but we can actually front run the governance aspects prior to being delivered to an operational team, like an analytics team or something like that. But it still requires those policies, even if we're just talking about policies, to be articulated by individuals. Now, those individuals, rather ironic, but they could go up to ChatGPT and say, what policies should we put in as policy as code into our delivery pipeline? They could do that, then it would get rather circular. But the intention, or the hope is, the way we're trying to encourage our engineers, governance engineers, to look at it, is to go to the stakeholders and say, okay, what are the policies? What are the guidelines you have in place now? The majority of them are logically coherent anyway. Translate those into code and embed them within the delivery pipelines, and that provides an additional level of assurance. Because just as we're talking about trustworthiness, we're also, another key term is assurance, and that's where data quality comes in, but we've been looking at governance here. So those aspects of oversight, delivering used by the operational teams with a level of assurance, which again implies confidence, means that we're accelerating a process, and that's another key term. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, large language models, they're accelerating our comprehension. And what's exciting is that we don't know sometimes what's going to come out. What I'm hoping is that when we run these DQ pipelines, they'll create a whole new series of DQ dimensions that they've generated themselves from their own algorithms. I can't wait. I find that really exciting. But some people don't.
Scary concept.
And that's and we have to respect that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, is that then the position that perhaps technology leaders need to take versus governments and regulators? So we've got the regulators suggesting that the producers of AI and machine learning need to be ensuring that they've got all of the controls in. And while these technology leaders could be those producers, they could also be consumers of this kind of technology. So what we're suggesting is that they need to be automating, augmenting, bringing that governance in to as much of their processes as possible. Absolutely. Yeah. Fantastic.
I think what I'd add there, while we're still talking on this, these terms of assurance and trustworthiness, is that one of the things that we both identified going through the EU AI Act is the exemption given to the military.
Absolutely.
Now, if we really fear some sort of Terminator-style immolation, destruction, whatever it might be, then how can that proceed? It's one thing talking about innovation, but how can we exempt the military when we're talking about responsibility, when we're talking about assurance, and yet within the same piece of legislation, the military are not integrated within that level of oversight and responsibility? What can we do about that?
So it's an interesting question, and it's one that I posed to you, I think, when we were discussing, was that the regulation itself suggests that general kind of localised laws should be able to support the military in their use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. But is that a possibility when our laws have not been written considering technology that's as advanced as this.
And again, I mean, let's not get too far into philosophy or human nature, but if we have this instinct to not be very kind to ourselves, then it's more important to bring in more effective coverage, because talking to you about those DQ dimensions, I mean, I'm serious. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out. But that same principle can be applied to all sorts of different areas. So the military, do they really, and this is where, as I say, not being an expert in ML or AI, I don't have an answer. But if these self-learning algorithms can develop outcomes that are unprepared, those unknown unknowns, those long tails that we get, we don't know what will be there, whether it's a Terminator style or it's something much more constructive. We don't know.
How do we, as governance professionals, ensure that what is produced from that is relevant and can be leveraged? If it's something that it's learnt itself and it's developed, the technology has developed these data quality dimensions. I think I certainly struggle with the concept of how do I know that it's right? And if it's something that I hadn't thought about and somebody in the industry hadn't already thought about, why should we leverage something that's produced like that? And how do we balance that?
And that's part of the challenge, isn't it? Because we initially, well, not us, because I certainly don't have the facility to do it, but setting up these self-learning algorithms to clean data, to scrub data, and they identify different patterns that we possibly have not seen, and our peers within the industry haven't seen those as potential quantitative or qualitative dimensions in terms of scrubbing data. But ultimately it comes down to how that self-learning algorithm is set up. So if it's set up by an engineer that has no understanding of data quality, then we could, I think quite rightly, challenge the output. But again, coming back to our governance engineers, that's why we're covering data quality with them.
Exactly.
So that they will have that level of expertise. So if they're putting these algorithms together, they will understand the fundamentals, the distinctions between qualitative, quantitative dimensions, etc., so that they'll be more alert to erroneous outcomes, where the machine has just decided that, well, running with this to the fourth iteration, this is what we think. But there will be, as there always is, there will be those unknown unknowns that even after we filter them, we will learn. We'll go, I never thought of that. But if those self-learning algorithms are not created by people that understand a broad range of aspects around data quality, and also this is the challenge, this is what I'm going to find so fun, that validating those dimensions, that the more experience you have, and this is where you can't get rid of people in this process, same with governance, the more experience you have, the broader range of filters you'll have intellectually in place to say whether this is a valid dimension or otherwise.
Yeah.
And that can only be covered, and I'm not bigging myself up here, but that can only be covered by people with
expertise.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's a nice kind of segue into the conversation of the evolution of AI, machine learning and governance, and how we create that basic governance framework or model to support something that is consistently developing and moving and I suppose a part of that is developing the skills and technology and the people that have almost a cross-functional set of skills to be able to support from different facets of knowledge. How do you see governance and machine learning kind of evolving together?
Potentially, these new outcomes that we don't know about.
Yes.
Other aspects, and as I say, we're keeping away from the ethics specifically in this chat, but the recognition, and this is what the EU Strategy for Data, the EU AI Act has tried to emphasize, and the Data Governance Act, all complementary to this EU data strategy, which, although we're not part of the EU, etc., has been incredibly informative and a really good read. And this is why we wanted to go through it and be able to provide it to our clients and the other consultants. But I think when we look at where the machine learning and governance as long as there are regulators in place that insist that how data is used and reported needs to meet the needs and requirements of the regulator, then governance will always need to run in tandem with machine learning or artificial intelligence, whatever it might be. Because if the regulator insists on that level of transparency, protection for the consumer or the country, I mean, you think about 2008, et cetera, I mean, BCBS 239 came about because we had systemic risk within the system that had not been prepared for.
Yes.
And was an incredibly expensive impact on various economies. So that regulation, that level of transparency, if we move into exclusively autocratic regimes where transparency is dimmed, that's when we get into those Terminator-style potentials.
Yeah.
Because the transparency is removed.
Absolutely. And I think that that unpreparedness from even like the 2008 financial crash and the regulation that came out of that, and you know, you're talking about transparency there as well, which is a key term in the GDPR. If we look back and think about all of that, we're almost in a kind of reflection of that now with this developing technology, which has come out so quickly and post a kind of big conversation that everybody went, AI, we need to get this ready. It grew so quickly and there was so much being developed that there is a lot of unknowns, that unknown that you talked about. Can we use the past and the decisions and the regulations from the past, that GDPR, the way that we prepared for GDPR, to preempt the actual implementation of future regulations? You know, the EU AI Act is not the only one. We talked about Chinese government producing regulations on the use of artificial intelligence, and there will be lots coming from all over the world. So organisations generally were not prepared enough for things like GDPR and for the 2008 financial crash. So how can we learn from that, use the governance that we've got, the regulations that we already have, the principles from regulation, to prepare for something like the EU AI Act and worldwide AI frameworks? How can we use that to prepare for them?
I think when we talk about using it or preparation, I think that's where the EU do provide us a very good model, because the consultative process, the deliberative process that goes in even prior to the EU Parliament signing these things off, even prior to the trilogue, et cetera, that developmental process is transparent within itself, and the accessibility to that process is wholly transparent as well. Just as it is in the US, having access to Congress, to the records, et cetera, we tend to talk about environments where that accessibility is clear.
Yes.
There's a process. When we look at environments where that accessibility is much more limited, then who's shining the torch? I'm sorry, a bit of an analogy, but who's shining the torch on how ML AI is being used in those instances? We don't know. Where are those bad actors, and how do we bring transparency to their activities? Well, we can't. So just as the development of nuclear weapons, et cetera, and rogue bombs, dirty bombs, et cetera, I'm sure this terminology will be transplanted over to machine learning and AI.
Yes.
Because there will be bad actors, and this isn't a walk down childhood. There will be bad actors that will be looking to use this technology to manipulate, to oppress. And as I say, we don't want to get into human rights here. But I'm only using these terms because this is why we certainly, as much as we can, talk about the transparency that comes about from the EU AI Act, and talk about how whether the UK is preparing with similar levels of deliberation, consultation, definitely not. The US has, within New York and California, has achieved a level of transparency. But there'll be other states that will consider those pieces of legislation wholly woke. That alliteration, WW, wholly woke, right?
Yes.
And this is why we need to talk about these different aspects, because governance is about oversight, it's about transparency, but we know from our own experience how difficult it is to persuade people to apply these methods of governance, to apply this oversight. How many times did I have to, we'd go through the training and everything else, and I'd say, when you experience the talk to the hand moment, that's when you develop the skills that make and demonstrate the importance of governance. And there's going to be lots in this process over the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be lots of talking to the hand.
Yes.
Because that level of intrusiveness, just as you were saying with the ChatGPT guy, well, I'm not going to involve myself in Europe, or I'm going to dumb down the algorithms prior to this regulation coming through. I mean, all these different things you read in the press, etc.
Yes.
But that talk to the hand moment is just going to be amplified over the next 10 years. And that's why certainly at Kubrick, we want to provide that level of transparency in how we provide a commentary on this development, because we've got this governance engineering cohort going at the moment. We're looking at different aspects of market insight, business intelligence, etc., moving towards that consultancy activity. So we have to demonstrate what best looks like.
Yes.
And this is what we always do. And we have a familiarity with the talk to the hand moment because we're trying to explain standards, processes that have evolved. They're not what we think are standards and processes, but there are a consensus of what, I wouldn't even say right thinking people because that gets too controversial, but what can be applied objectively to protect the outcomes of data usage.
Yeah, and I think that there's a couple of talk to the hand moments that I can see that will spring to mind over the next two years, kind of even as the AI Act is developing and being passed. And it's that in the press conference, for example, post the parliamentary discussions on the AI Act, one of them mentioned that actually the Brussels effect, so Europe actually setting the stage for this, isn't going to be enough anymore for something like this, where there's so much AI technology being developed in the US, which I think to me poses a suggestion that actually there could be quite a lot of changes for this over the next 2 years as they're having these discussions in the trilogue that you're talking about, because they want to bring in the perspectives of the US rather than saying we are going to set our guidelines and the rest of the world will follow. It's now actually we've set our guidelines, but let's see if these need to be adjusted in line with the rest of the world. And I think that sets a kind of almost a blocker, an excuse for organisations to say, well, we're not going to do any kind of pre-preparation because it could change. And that then I think leads to, I suppose, more of the challenge, which we all know was a problem when GDPR came into play, and organisations went, we're not ready, we're not prepared, we've got 2 years to prepare, but 2 years is a long time. Then 3 weeks before they're all panicking. I think it's an interesting shift in that I think organisations need to respect that, there is going to be changes, but they can still do what they can now to perhaps prepare for compliance so that when the act comes in, they're reaching that excellence point of leveraging technology tools, governance, and implementing it all round. Fantastic. So I think we've reached the end of our major discussion today. We could carry on talking for a long time, Simon, I'm sure. But next episode, like I said, we're going to be talking more about that unpeopled governance, that automated without as much oversight and input from people, and how we bring AI, machine learning, engineering and data governance properly together to meet the needs of the industry. So thank you very much for your time. Any closing remarks? Anything you think we've missed that we need to cover?
No, just tune into the next podcast is what I'd say. Thank you, Molly. Hopefully you felt you had enough. It wasn't just me gassing.
No, that was lovely.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic.